Hey everyone. So I was looking at today's readings, the fourth Sunday in Lent, and seeing how we can apply them to our lives today, again, given this whole coronavirus situation that we're going through. So if we look at today's first reading in 1 Samuel, it's the story about how Samuel anoints David. He goes to Jesse's family. He is sent by God to pick the one to anoint, the one who will be king. And when he comes to Jesse's family and he tells them what he was sent for, what his mission is, to anoint one of Jesse's sons, he lines up all of his sons, well, 7 of them. And he looks at the biggest one, the strongest one, the oldest one, and he says, none of these are the ones that is going to get anointed. You have another son. And he says, well, yeah, there's the young one. He's out there tending the sheep. He's the shepherd doing the dirty work. And he brings him in, and Samuel sees the youngest son, the weakest son, the one doing the dirty work. And he says, this is the one that we're going to anoint. This is the one that God has chosen for his purposes. And so what we see in this story, a couple of lessons that we can apply, is that God doesn't see things the way we see things. That God sees the heart and we see the exterior. And the next is patience. Because when David was anointed, he didn't get to become king right away. He had to wait for Saul to die so that David could take the throne afterwards. So patience. When we move on to the gospel reading for today is the entire chapter of John 9, and it's the story of Jesus healing a man born blind. And when we read this story, we see a lot of negative, some positive. It's full of blame and accusations and excuses and stubbornness. But there's some good working through it all if that's what we can focus on. So Jesus tells this man born blind, who's normally sitting and begging, and he tells him, he puts some clay on his eyes. And then after that, he tells him to go bathe in that pool, the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so the man does exactly that. He follows the directions. After the clay is on his eyes, he goes into the pool, he washes, he bathes, he comes out, and the man can see. So the people ask Jesus, before this miracle happens, who's to blame for this? Who sinned? Was it this man's parents? Or was it this man himself? And Jesus, he answers, he says, this is a false dilemma because neither of them are responsible in sin for this occurrence. God chose that this man be born blind with this defect so that God could work through it. What this man couldn't see, his inability to see, God made visible his works. And so then the people question, well, is this really that man who used to sit and beg? And the man says, no, yeah, that's me. And some people say, well, yeah, we can accept that. We don't have an answer for how this is possible, but we'll accept it. But some people say, no, that's not possible. This is just a man that looks like that guy a lot, but it's not the same person. There's this false assumption here. And the assumption is that can't possibly be the same man because I know how things work. I know how things should work, and this doesn't align with my preconceived notions. But the cured man himself explains for the first time what happened. And he explains, he put the clay in my eyes, I went into the pool and bathed, and I could see. I don't know how I can, I just followed the instructions. And so the people bring him to the leaders, they bring him to the Pharisees, and they say, okay, tell your story to them. So he tells the same story over a second time. But the Pharisees, they don't believe him. And so they say, well, send for this man's parents. Which makes sense. In a Jewish culture, you have to have at least 2 witnesses to testify to a given event. And so they ask, is this your son? Is he born blind? Did this man Jesus heal him? Is that how he can see today? And they say, look, we don't know who healed him. We don't know how he can see. So that we can't testify to. What we can testify to is what we do know. And what we do know is this, that this is our son, and he was born blind. This sounds a lot like how miracles today are confirmed. If there's a given medical miracle, doctors are asked to testify to what they know. That what we do know is this is not how something normally happens, and that there is no medical explanation for how this miracle, for how this event occurred. And the cured man chimes in and he says, all I know is that I was blind and now I can see. And so then the Pharisees jump to the accusation. Well, Jesus must be a sinner because he healed this man on the Sabbath. There's this preconceived notion that I know how God should work, when God should work, that God would do this or that. He works in this way. That's my assumption, in my preconceived little box. So could God really be present now in all of this confusion, this chaos, this isolation, this suffering, this drought? Is there something that God could really be working in? So the Pharisees, again, they're like, let's hear the story again. There's some fault that we're going to have to find in it. And so the third time, this man is asked to tell his story. But at this point, he's like, look, you've already heard my story. I don't need to tell it again. But the Pharisees, they admit this much. They don't know where Jesus comes from. They try to say, like, look, we follow Moses, and we know that Moses comes from God, but we don't know where this man comes from. And this man doesn't act like how we think God would act because he healed on the Sabbath. So they've made an assumption about where they don't think Jesus could come from. But the cured man's answer is this. They say, here's what's so amazing, is that you don't know where he comes from. But what he has done doesn't correspond to what we do know of whom we call sinners. They say God doesn't hear sinners. He doesn't answer their prayers. He doesn't work in sin. He can work through it. He can redeem it. But the way Jesus works is not a sinner. And the Pharisees get mad at this response, probably because this man is right. So they make another assumption. And they tell this man, look, you were born blind. That means you were born in sin. They go back to this false dilemma of what Jesus has already dismissed. And they say, it's not possible that we could learn from you. Their pride gets in the way. These educated men in the Jewish culture, these Pharisees, these leaders, who are supposed to be able to answer these tough religious questions, assume that they can't possibly learn from this man. And so they throw him out. And the Pharisees can't even see what it is that they're doing wrong. And so here's what we can learn, I think, from our Old Testament and Gospel readings for this week. In the Old Testament, we see that the outcome is not what we would expect. And ultimately, it requires patience. Patience in this situation. A situation that we already know today. It's not going to be a week or two. We are called to stay in our homes for a couple of weeks at least. Some of us can't return to work for months. And that leads to all kinds of uncertainty. But we don't need the answers now, today. We need to be patient. In the gospel readings, again, we see assumptions and accusations and excuses and stubbornness when this man is asked the same question over and over again. We see blame. Which one of these people sinned? We see pride when the Pharisees dismiss the inability to learn from this man. We see name calling, that Jesus is a sinner too. The reality is there's this inability to accept reality. There's this inability to accept that in this situation, there is goodness. There's the inability to accept the one who brought the goodness. And there's the inability to accept that the ones doing the accusing are the ones in the wrong. So how can we apply this directly to our situation? First, let's redirect our focus. There's so much that I'm seeing in articles and posts and news in the way of who is to blame for this. As so much as what the name of this virus is, the actions or inactions of our civil political leaders, who can we blame? I guess that's a natural human instinct. But what good does blame and name calling do for us? It doesn't change the past, and it doesn't solve the current situation. I mean, what would it change if someone did step up and say, okay, I'm to blame for all of this? Would it suddenly ease our worries? Would it maybe actually completely disarm us after we say, I knew it? Because then what? Would it really make us feel any better? It doesn't give us control of this situation. It doesn't fix anything. What we see when we read the Gospels holistically is that God took the blame for us. He joined us in humanity. He embraced the cross, and as an innocent victim, he took all of the blame upon himself, and then he destroyed it. Upon the destruction of that evil that he carried, he made all things new. So rather than focus on who's to blame, let's all try to be patient, to simply accept the situation as it is, and then to focus on the positive.